The Echoes in the Pixels, Chapter 1. At 62, my life felt settled. Quiet, a gentle coasting after years of raising a family and navigating the complexities of adulthood. I was a creature of habit, finding comfort in routine, in the familiar rhythms of my days. My past felt like a distant country, visited only in quiet moments of reflection, its landscape shaped and solidified by the passage of time and the filter of memory. I thought I understood my own history, the pivotal moments, the relationships that had left their mark, both good and bad, especially the bad ones. There was one relationship in particular that I had carefully packed away in the furthest corner of my mind, a painful chapter I rarely revisited. Mark. We had been together in my late 20s, a passionate, all-consuming love that ended abruptly and messily, leaving behind a trail of hurt and misunderstanding. The memories were fractured, colored by anger and sadness, a narrative of betrayal and a harsh final parting. I had moved on, built a life, married, had children. But the sting of that ending, the conviction that I had been deeply wronged, had stayed with me, a silent scar. My late husband, bless his soul, had helped heal many wounds, but some went too deep, becoming a part of the fabric of who I was. I had buried the anger towards Mark, the feeling of betrayal, allowing time to create a distance, a dulling of the sharp edges of memory. But the core narrative remained. He had hurt me, he had let me down when I needed him most, and our story ended in a way that confirmed my worst fears about vulnerability and trust. Cleaning out the attic, a task I had put off for years, unearthed not just dusty boxes of old clothes and forgotten furniture, but also ghosts of the past. Tucked away in a box labeled Electronics Old, I found a jumble of cables, chargers for phones I no longer owned, and a few old USB drives. Technology from a different era, quickly made obsolete. Most of the drives were empty or contained mundane work files. But one, a small silver one, I vaguely remembered using around the time I was with Mark, felt different. It was labeled simply, in my younger handwriting, Memories. Plugging it into my modern laptop felt like connecting to another time, another version of myself. The laptop recognized the drive. Opening a folder filled with files dated from the late 1980s and early 1990s, digital relics from the early days of personal computing and digital photography. There were documents, old resumes, drafts of letters, random notes, and then the photographs, hundreds of them. Digital photos, low resolution by today's standards, but vibrant with the colors of a life lived decades ago. Photos of friends I had lost touch with, family gatherings from years gone by, places I had traveled. And then, photos of Mark, photos of us, together. My breath hitched. I hadn't looked at pictures of Mark in decades. I had thrown away the physical ones years ago, in a fit of anger and a desire to erase the past. But these digital copies had survived, tucked away on a forgotten drive. I started scrolling through them, hesitantly at first, then with a growing, morbid curiosity. Photos of us laughing, holding hands, exploring places together, moments of happiness I had allowed the painful ending to overshadow, to erase from the dominant narrative of our relationship. The photos brought back fragmented memories, pieces of a time I had intentionally buried. They were bittersweet, a reminder of the love we had shared, the connection that had once felt so real. But as I scrolled deeper into the files, the photos took a different turn. They were from the last few months of our relationship, the period leading up to the messy breakup. This was the time I remembered most vividly, most painfully. There were pictures of a trip we took to the coast. I remembered that trip. It was meant to be a romantic getaway, a chance to reconnect, but it had ended in a terrible argument, fueled by stress and unspoken resentments. My memory of that trip was a blur of tension, tears, and the final crushing weight of our relationship crumbling. I clicked on a folder labeled Coast Trip, Fall, 1990. Inside, more photos. Photos of the scenery, the ocean, the small cottage we rented. And then, photos of Mark, alone, walking on the beach, looking out at the sea. His face etched with what looked like worry or sadness. I clicked on a short video file. It was shaky, clearly taken quickly, perhaps even accidentally. It showed the interior of the cottage. My younger self was visible for a moment, looking stressed, distracted. And then the camera focused on Mark. He was sitting at a table, his back to the camera, talking on the phone. His voice was low, urgent, filled with concern. I couldn't make out the words clearly. The audio was poor, but the tone was undeniable. He was worried, deeply worried. This didn't fit my memory of that time. My memory was of him being distant, preoccupied, perhaps even indifferent to my emotional distress. But in this video, he looked vulnerable, concerned, actively trying to deal with something serious. The video ended. I watched it again and again. His posture, the tension in his shoulders, the urgency in his voice. It suggested a crisis, something far more significant than the petty arguments I remembered. The photos that followed the video were taken after the argument, after I had retreated into a hurt, angry silence. They showed Mark alone in the cottage, looking lost and upset. And then a series of photos of him making phone calls, looking increasingly frustrated and anxious. These weren't the actions of someone indifferent or dismissive. These were the actions of someone dealing with something difficult, something urgent. My carefully constructed narrative of that breakup, the story of his betrayal and my being wronged, began to feel less solid, less certain. What if my memory was incomplete? What if there was more to that time than I had allowed myself to remember or to see? Chapter 2. The discovery of the photos and the video from that fateful trip to the coast in 1990 was like dropping a stone into the still waters of my memory. The ripples spread, disturbing the calm surface, bringing up sediment from the bottom, challenging the clear reflection I thought I had of the past. My memory of the end of my relationship with Mark was a solidified narrative of betrayal and hurt. I remembered feeling abandoned, believing he wasn't there for me when I needed him, that he was selfish and uncaring. The breakup was the inevitable conclusion of that perceived failing. But the digital echoes on the old USB drive told a different story, or at least hinted at one. Mark's obvious distress in the video, his frantic phone calls in the photos, it suggested he was dealing with a crisis, something that preoccupied him, something he was struggling with, possibly in silence. Why hadn't he told me? Why hadn't he shared what was happening? My younger self, hurt and feeling neglected, had interpreted his preoccupation as indifference, as a lack of care for me and our relationship. The anger and the feeling of betrayal had been the result. But now, with the perspective of decades and the undeniable evidence of his distress in those captured moments, I began to question my own interpretation. What if he couldn't tell me? What if the crisis was something he had to deal with alone? What if my own emotional needs at the time had blinded me to what he was going through? The possibility that my memory, my long-held narrative of the breakup, was flawed, incomplete, or even entirely wrong, was unsettling. It meant I had carried a burden of anger and resentment towards Mark for decades, based on a misunderstanding, a truth I had never known. I felt a growing need to understand what was happening with Mark during that trip, what crisis he was facing, and why he hadn't shared it with me. It wasn't about rekindling an old romance. That chapter of my life was long closed. It was about resolving the lingering questions, about potentially letting go of the resentment I had carried for so long, about understanding the full truth of that painful ending. Finding Mark after over 30 years felt daunting. I knew his last name, of course, but I had no idea where he was or what he was doing. Our lives had diverged completely. I started with online searches, a familiar tool for connecting with the past in the digital age. Searching for his name yielded many results. It was a common name. I tried adding details, his approximate age, the area where we had lived. It narrowed the search, but still presented several possibilities. I looked for him on social media platforms. I found a few profiles that matched his name and age range, but none that definitively looked like him. People change over 30 years. I thought about reaching out to mutual friends from that time, but like many people, we had drifted apart from those friends after the relationship ended. Our social circles had been intertwined, and the breakup had created a natural separation. The search felt like trying to find a single grain of sand on a vast, ever-shifting beach. The digital world, which had provided the spark for this renewed search, now felt too large, too anonymous. One evening, feeling discouraged, I looked at the old USB drive again. I opened the folder from the coast trip, re-watching the short video clip of Mark on the phone. I focused on the blurry background, on any details that might offer a clue. There was a window behind him, showing a glimpse of the outside. A rocky landscape, pine trees, the coast. I paused the video on the frame where he was most visible. His expression was one of deep worry. I tried to analyze the sound, the low murmur of his voice. Could I make out any words, any context? The audio was too distorted, too unclear. Then, I noticed something else in the photos taken after the video. A small, partially visible logo on a piece of paper on the table beside him. It was blurry, but it looked like a stylized wave and some letters. S-I-W-S-I-W. What did that mean? Was it connected to the crisis he was dealing with? I zoomed in on the image, trying to make out the logo more clearly. The stylized wave, the letters S-I-W. It looked like a company logo, or perhaps an organization. I started searching online for companies or organizations with the initials S-I-W, particularly ones that might be related to the coast, or to the kind of work Mark did. He was an engineer. It was a long shot, but it was a new thread to pull. The search was broad, yielding many results, but then I found something that caught my eye. A small, non-profit organization based on the coast, dedicated to marine research and wildlife rescue. Its acronym was SIW. The logo was a stylized wave. SIW, Sea Island Wildlife. Based on the coast, not far from where we had taken that trip. Could this be connected? Was the crisis Mark was dealing with related to this organization, to marine research or wildlife rescue? It seemed like a strange fit for his engineering background, but people's lives take unexpected turns. I visited the SIW website. It was filled with information about their work, their mission, their team. I scrolled through the About Us section, looking for staff members, for anyone named Mark. I found a listing for Mark Sullivan, Director of Operations. Mark Sullivan, Director of Operations at a marine research and wildlife rescue organization. The photo beside the name showed a man with graying hair and lines on his face. Older now, but with eyes that held a familiar depth, a familiar kindness. It was him, Mark. Seeing his name, his face, attached to an organization dedicated to helping marine life, a profound realization washed over me. Mark had always loved the ocean, had a deep respect for nature. Perhaps the crisis he was dealing with during that trip was related to this work, to something urgent happening with the organization, something that required his full attention. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together, forming a new picture of that time. A picture that challenged my long-held narrative of betrayal and indifference. Chapter 3, Reconnecting with Mark, after over 30 years, was a daunting prospect. The anger and resentment I had carried for so long had begun to dissipate, replaced by a complex mix of regret, curiosity, and a desire for understanding. Seeing him, knowing what he was doing with his life, understanding the possible context of his distress during our last trip together, it changed everything. I found an email address for him on the SIW website. I drafted a message carefully, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. How do you summarize 30 years of unspoken history? A painful breakup based on a potential misunderstanding, and a sudden desire for connection in an email? I decided on honesty, delivered gently. I introduced myself, reminded him of who I was, and mentioned finding some old digital photos and a video from our time together. Specifically from our trip to the coast in 1990. I said that looking at them had brought back memories and raised some questions about that time, that it seemed he was dealing with something difficult during that trip, something I hadn't understood at the time. I explained that I wasn't looking to revisit the past in a hurtful way, but simply to understand, to gain some clarity about a time that had been painful for me and perhaps for him as well. I included my contact information, inviting him to connect if he felt comfortable. Sending the email felt like sending a message in a bottle across a vast ocean. I didn't know if he would receive it, if he would remember me kindly, if he would even want to talk to me after all these years. Days turned into a week. No response. Doubt began to creep in. Maybe he didn't get the email. Maybe he didn't remember me. Maybe he did remember and had no desire to revisit a painful chapter of his own past. Just as I was starting to lose hope, my phone rang, An unknown number with a coastal area code. My heart leaped into my throat. I took a deep breath and answered. Hello? Sarah? Is that Sarah? The voice was male, older now, a little weathered, but instantly recognizable. Mark. Mark? I said, my voice trembling slightly. Yes, it's Sarah. I got your email, he said. His voice was quiet, hesitant. I was surprised to hear from you, Sarah. After all this time. I know, I said softly. I was surprised to be sending it, but finding those old photos, it brought back a lot and raised some questions about that trip, about that time. That trip, he repeated, a hint of sadness in his voice. Yes, that was a difficult time. The video, I said, from the cottage. You were on the phone. You looked so worried. And the photos after, it seemed like you were dealing with something serious, something I didn't understand. There was a long silence on his end. Then he sighed, a heavy sound. Yes, Sarah, he said. I was dealing with a crisis, a major one, with SIW, an oil spill, a bad one. It happened just as we arrived for the trip. I got the call that first evening. An oil spill, a major environmental crisis. It made sense. His distress, his frantic phone calls. He was dealing with a disaster. I didn't know, I whispered. You didn't tell me. I couldn't, he said. Not really. It was classified at first, and it was overwhelming, all-consuming. I didn't want to ruin our trip, but I also couldn't focus on anything else. I tried to handle it discreetly, but it was impossible. I thought you were just being distant. I admitted, the long-held pain surfacing, that you didn't care, that something was wrong with us. No, Sarah, he said firmly. Nothing was wrong with us. The crisis was external, and I handled it badly. I was so focused on the disaster, on trying to contain it, that I didn't explain things to you. I shut down. I pulled away. And you were hurting, and you needed me. And I wasn't there in the way you needed me to be. That was my failing. Hearing him say that, acknowledging his part in the misunderstanding, felt like a weight being lifted from my shoulders. A narrative I had carried for 30 years, finally being rewritten with truth and clarity. I was angry for a long time, Mark, I said, tears welling up. I felt betrayed, like you had let me down. I know, he said softly. And you had every right to feel that way. My silence, my inability to communicate what was happening, it created a space for doubt and pain. I regretted it deeply, Sarah, not just losing you, but the way it ended, knowing that you were hurting and I couldn't explain. We talked for a long time, the conversation flowing easily now, bridging the decades of silence. We spoke about our lives, the paths we had taken, the people we had become. There was no lingering resentment, only a shared understanding of a pivotal moment in our lives that had been shaped by a painful misunderstanding, a truth obscured by silence and hurt. Chapter 4. Our conversation felt like a turning point, a release of decades of unspoken emotion and misunderstanding. The anger and resentment I had harbored towards Mark for so long dissipated, replaced by a profound sense of understanding and a quiet sorrow for the way things had ended. It wasn't about blame anymore. It was about two people, young and imperfect, navigating a difficult situation with limited communication and emotional tools. Mark had carried his own burden of regret, the knowledge that his silence had caused me pain, and ultimately led to the end of our relationship. Hearing him acknowledge his failing, his inability to communicate during that crisis, was a crucial part of my own healing process. We continued to talk over the following weeks, phone calls turning into video chats. We shared more about our lives, our families, the joys and sorrows we had experienced in the 30 years we were apart. It was a strange and wonderful experience, reconnecting with someone who had been such a significant part of my youth. Someone whose memory had been colored by pain, now seem in a new, clearer light. There was a comfortable ease between us, a rediscovery of the connection that had once drawn us together. It wasn't the passionate love of our 20s, but something quieter, deeper, built on shared history, mutual respect, and the wisdom gained through lived experience. We talked about the possibility of meeting in person. It felt like a natural next step in this unexpected journey of reconnection. Mark lived on the coast now, dedicated to his work with SIW. I lived in my quiet town, rooted in my life here. A romantic reunion wasn't the goal, but a chance to see each other face to face, to bring a tangible reality to the connection we were rebuilding. We decided he would come to my town. It felt less disruptive than me traveling to the coast. The town held memories for both of us, the setting of our early relationship. Waiting for him to arrive felt both exciting and nerve-wracking. How would it feel to see him after all these years? Would the connection we had rediscovered over the phone translate to in-person interaction? He arrived on a sunny afternoon, looking older, of course, but with the same kind eyes and a warm smile that instantly put me at ease. We hugged, a comfortable embrace that felt both familiar and new. We spent the next few days together, revisiting places from our past, the park where we used to walk, the old bookstore we frequented, the cafe where we had our first date. It was a journey down memory lane, but with a new perspective, a shared understanding of the years that had passed and the lives we had built. We talked more about the oil spill, the crisis that had overshadowed our last trip together. He shared the details of the disaster, the long hours, the immense pressure he was under. It was a difficult time for him, professionally and personally, and in the midst of it, he had lost me. "I should have told you," he said again, his voice filled with regret. "I was wrong not to. I was trying to protect you from the stress, I think. But in doing so, I created a different kind of pain. And I should have been more understanding," I said, "more patient. I was young and focused on my own hurt. I didn't see what you were going through." Forgiveness wasn't something that needed to be explicitly granted. It was something that unfolded naturally, a quiet acceptance of past mistakes, both his and mine. The anger I had carried for so long dissolved completely, replaced by a sense of empathy for the young man who had been caught in a storm he couldn't control, and the woman who had misinterpreted his struggle. Our time together was peaceful, reflective, a celebration of a connection rediscovered, a testament to the fact that even after decades, the threads of a shared history can be woven back together, creating something new and meaningful. There was no dramatic declaration of love, no grand plan to rekindle a romance. Our lives were established, rooted in different places, but we had found something perhaps even more valuable: a deep, enduring friendship, a connection built on understanding, forgiveness, and the shared knowledge of a past that had been painful, but was now finally healed. Chapter 5. Mark's visit brought a profound sense of closure. A healing of old wounds that I hadn't realized were still festering beneath the surface of my life. The narrative of betrayal and hurt that had colored my memory of our breakup for 30 years was replaced by a story of misunderstanding, of difficult circumstances, and of two people navigating a challenging time with imperfect communication. The digital echoes on the old USB drive, the photos and the video from that fateful trip had been the catalyst for this healing, a window into a past that was more complex and nuanced than my memory had allowed me to see. They were no longer just painful reminders of a failed relationship, but evidence of a hidden truth, a starting point for a journey of understanding and reconciliation. Mark returned to his life on the coast, and I returned to my quiet routine. But something had shifted. The silence where the anger and resentment used to reside was now filled with a quiet sense of peace, a lightness I hadn't felt in years. We continued to stay in touch, regular phone calls and video chats becoming a new rhythm in my life. We talked about our days, shared our joys and frustrations, offered each other support and companionship. The connection felt natural, easy, a continuation of the deep bond we had shared years ago, matured by time and experience. We didn't dwell on the past, but we didn't shy away from it either. We had faced the difficult truth, acknowledged the pain, and in doing so, had released the burden of resentment. The what-ifs of a life not lived together were less important than the connection we had rediscovered, the friendship we were building in the present. My children saw the change in me. They saw the peace that had replaced the lingering sadness they had sensed, even if they didn't fully understand its source. I shared parts of the story with them, enough to explain the significance of Mark's return to my life, enough to help them understand the complexities of past relationships and the possibility of healing and forgiveness. The old USB drive sat on my desk now, not tucked away in a box in the attic. It was a reminder of the power of technology to preserve memories, but also to reveal hidden truths, to challenge our established narratives, and to offer opportunities for understanding and reconciliation. The photos and video, once painful echoes of a breakup, were now seen as evidence of a difficult time, a time that led to a period of separation, but also, eventually, to healing and a renewed connection. The journey of confronting a painful past, guided by the digital ghosts of old memories, had led me not to a rekindled romance, but to something perhaps more valuable in this phase of my life: the deep, authentic friendship with a man who had once been the source of significant pain, but was now a source of quiet joy and companionship. My life was still ordinary, but it was also richer, more complete. The echoes in the pixels had spoken, revealing a truth that had been hidden for decades, releasing me from the burden of a past misunderstanding and opening a pathway to a future filled with the quiet comfort of a rediscovered connection. The scar was still there, a reminder of a wound, but it was no longer raw and painful. It was a healed scar, a testament to a life lived, lessons learned, and the enduring power of forgiveness and understanding, even when facilitated by the forgotten technology of a bygone era.